Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take sources you send us, dig in deep, and pull out the key insights for you fast. It's like your personal research assistant.
Exactly, helping you get up to speed quickly.
And today we're diving into a really interesting book one of you mentioned, 4 Years of Economic Change Trump. It's actually available now on Amazon if you want the full read.
Right. And our mission today is to unpack what this book says about the potential economic and technological shifts if there were a second Trump term, say 2024 to 2028.
Yeah, we'll look at the analysis in the book covering the first-term policies, the promises for a second term, and what the experts cited in the book are predicting, basically giving you the core takeaways.
It's a useful way to think about it, grounding potential futures in, well, recent history and stated plans. This book gives us that structure.
Okay, let's kick things off by looking back at that first term, 2016 to 2020. The book really hammers home the America First idea as the main driver, right?
Absolutely. That was sort of the banner over everything. And several big policy areas stand out from the book's analysis.
Like the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, TCJA.
Yeah, the TCJA in 2017, huge deal. Big cut in the corporate tax rate, down from 35 to 21%.
Aimed at boosting business investment, presumably?
That was the rationale, yeah. Plus changes for individuals, simplifying brackets, increasing the standard deduction. But, the book makes it clear there was a lot of debate.
About who really benefited.
Exactly. Critics argued it disproportionately helped wealthier individuals and corporations. So, a key takeaway from the book right there. Tax cuts spurred growth, but also debate about fairness.
Right. And then trade. Very visible shifts there.
Oh, yeah. Renegotiating NAFTA became the USMCA, and then the whole trade situation with China. Tariffs.
Trying to reduce the trade deficit, boost U.S. manufacturing.
That was the stated goal, according to the book's analysis. Whether it fully worked is, well, debatable. But it definitely signaled a major shift towards protectionism, a different approach to global trade.
And deregulation was another big pillar, wasn't it?
Across various sectors, energy, finance, environmental rules.
The book says the aim was cutting red tape to stimulate growth.
Correct. Freeing up businesses. But, as the book also notes, that came with counter-arguments, right? Concerns about environmental impacts, social consequences.
So if you look at the overall economy back then, the book mentions, historically low unemployment, strong stock market before the pandemic hit.
Yeah, the headline numbers look pretty good.
Yeah.
The book attributes some of that to the tax cuts, the pro-business stance.
But it also flags the criticisms, right? Lagging wage growth for many, maybe widening inequality.
Exactly. And that's a crucial tension the book highlights. Strong top-line numbers don't always mean everyone's feeling prosperous. That's important context.
Okay, let's switch gears to technology during that first term. The book says it wasn't maybe the top priority, but significant things still happened.
For sure. Like the push on 5G development, a real emphasis on the U.S. leading the way and pushing back against China, especially Huawei.
Recognizing 5G as critical infrastructure, basically.
Yeah, economically and for national security, that comes through clearly in the book's analysis.
And Space Force, can't forget that. Plus more NASA funding, focus on Moon and Mars involving private companies like SpaceX.
Right. The book highlights this mix of national security, tech advancement, and public-private partnerships. Space as a strategic frontier, both military and commercial.
Then there were the clashes with big tech. Twitter, Facebook, Google, accusations of bias, talk of regulation.
Yeah, that really blew up the debate around free speech online, platform accountability. The book points to the administration tackling these issues head-on, raising those fundamental questions we're still grappling with.
And finally, cybersecurity got more attention.
It did. More focus on protecting critical infrastructure, using sanctions against suspected attackers. The book notes some critics wanted stronger action, but it was definitely a rising priority, acknowledging the digital threats.
Okay, that sets the stage well, drawing from the book's look back. Now let's get into what the book analyzes regarding promises for a potential second term, 2024 onwards. It frames a potential return as this extraordinary comeback.
Fueled by that loyal base, yeah. And the focus on restoring American greatness. The book details some pretty specific economic promises.
Let's start with taxes again. What's on the table, according to the book?
Well, a big one is extending those individual and estate tax cuts from the TCJA, which are set to expire.
Okay.
And potentially further cuts to the corporate rate, maybe down to 15% for stuff made in the U.S.,
Yeah.
trying to incentivize domestic production.
Interesting. What else on taxes?
Some other ideas floated, according to the book's sources, eliminating federal tax on tips, Social Security benefits, maybe overtime pay, making car loan interest deductible, tax credits for family caregivers.
Wow, quite a list. Seems aimed at different groups.
Yeah, a mix of broad cuts and targeted relief with that strong emphasis on made in the USA.
And trade. Sounds like maybe doubling down.
That's how the book presents the proposals. Like a potential baseline tariff of maybe 10 or 20% on all imports.
All imports.
Yeah, potentially. And maybe even higher, like up to 60% on goods from China. Plus, specific tariffs targeting, say, Mexican cars or companies moving jobs overseas.
That sounds disruptive.
The book's analysis definitely suggests it would be. A dramatic escalation of protectionism compared to the first term. Potential for higher prices, trade friction.
Energy and environment. More the same direction.
Seems like it, based on the book. Boosting fossil fuels, easing drilling rules, maybe in places like the Arctic, rolling back green regulations, even talk of rescinding unspent funds from the Inflation Reduction Act.
Prioritizing traditional energy, energy independence.
That appears to be the philosophy outlined. But again, the book flags the environmental trade-offs.
The book also mentions some less conventional ideas. Housing, infrastructure, freedom cities.
Yeah, reducing regulations for construction, opening up federal land, these freedom cities concepts. And the book notes the argument linking mass deportation to potentially lowering housing costs.
That's certainly a specific argument presented in the source material.
It is. And it raises huge questions, economically and socially, that the book touches upon. The Freedom Cities idea is also pretty novel, potentially impacting land use significantly.
What about inflation? A big concern for everyone.
The book notes a pledge to end inflation, but points out the source material it reviewed was light on specific plans for how.
So a goal stated, but the roadmap is maybe less clear.
That's what the analysis suggests you should watch for the concrete proposals.
And then the themes of broad deregulation and incentivizing reshoring through tariffs and taxes seem consistent.
Very much so. It boils down to that core philosophy. Less government intervention, more domestic production equals prosperity. That's the recurring message the book identifies.
Okay, and crypto. This seems like a shift, doesn't it? The book talks about a national Bitcoin stockpile.
It's quite a turnaround from past skepticism. The book mentions promises like aiming to be the crypto capital, maybe government holding Bitcoin. It even notes a Bitcoin price jump after the election win in its analysis.
And ending the anti-crypto crusade, replacing the SEC chair.
Yeah. It signals a potentially much friendlier stance towards digital assets, a recognition of the sector's growing importance. But, the book rightly adds, how you actually do all this, the implementation, is very unclear. Needs laws, regulations.
A potential major shift to watch then.
Definitely. Especially that idea of a national stockpile.
All right, so we've got the promises laid out based on the book. Now it moves into the expert analysis section, what the U.S. economy might actually look like. And GDP forecasts seem varied.
Yeah, the book presents a range. Some analysts see modest growth, maybe slightly above baseline in a limited Trump scenario. Others see a potential drag, maybe even shrinking below baseline in a full-blown policy scenario.
So, quite uncertain.
Very. Some specific forecasts mentioned put annual growth potentially lower, like 1.3% compared to maybe 2.8% under baseline Biden policies. The Wharton model suggests slightly lower GDP, too, by 2034. It really depends on which policies get through and how they interact.
And the impact on the deficit and national debt. The book seems concerned there.
Strongly concerned, yes. It cites Estimates Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, Penn-Wharton budget model, projecting potentially trillions added to the debt over 10 years, like $5.5 or $5.8 trillion, depending on the model.
Wow. Big numbers.
Huge implications for debt, interest rates, future spending. That's a key takeaway from the analysis section.
What about the impact of those tax cuts specifically? Short-term boost versus long-term cost?
That's the trade-off the book highlights. Potentially some short-term relief across income groups.
Right.
But the analysis raises flags about larger deficits hindering long-term growth, maybe crowding out other investments.
And the trade and tariff analysis. Beyond just revenue, what are the risks?
Big risks, according to the economists cited. Retaliation is almost certain. Disrupted supply chains. Higher prices for consumers. The book emphasizes tariffs essentially act like a tax on imports. Reigniting inflation is a major worry mentioned.
Which brings us to inflation and the Fed. Potential for a second wave of inflation.
Yeah, the analysis suggests policies like tariffs and maybe tighter immigration could push inflation up significantly, maybe 7 percentage points higher by 2026 in one estimate. There's also concern noted about potential pressure on the Federal Reserve's independence.
Undermining the Fed?
If the Fed feels pressured into looser policy than it otherwise would choose, that could fuel inflation and potentially lead to capital flight investors getting nervous.
What about the labor market impact of, say, mass deportations?
The book's analysis points to potential labor shortages, especially in sectors reliant on immigrant workers. Could push wages up in some areas, but might also constrain overall growth if businesses can't find workers.
Does the book break down impacts by industry?
It does touch on that. Like, the auto industry might benefit from certain tax policies, but industries relying heavily on imports would likely face cost pressures from tariffs. Agriculture is another complex one, sensitive to trade disputes.
So the long-term picture painted by the book's analysis, short-term stimulus maybe, but worries about sustainability.
That seems to be the gist. The Penn-Wharton model, for instance, looking way out to 2054, projected lower GDP and wages compared to baseline, so concerns about the lasting impact on the economy's trajectory.
What about markets? Any predictions there?
The book notes potential for some initial optimism, maybe S&P 500 gains in the short term, but it stresses that long-term performance really hinges on how policies are implemented and the broader economic fallout. Expect volatility, it suggests.
And internationally, increased tensions.
Definitely a theme. The book highlights the risk of escalating trade disputes, especially with China and the EU. Retaliatory tariffs could really snarl global supply chains.
Okay, now let's broaden out to the global economy, based on the book's analysis. Also projecting slower growth.
Yes, several forecasts cited point that way. Oxford Economics, UBS, London School of Economics, they generally see Trump's proposed policies, especially the trade stuff, acting as a drag on global GDP growth.
And the scale of these proposed tariffs globally.
The book mentions potentially 10 times the value of goods hit by tariffs compared to the first term. That, plus likely retaliation, really fuels fears of a new, more intense trade war.
Which could push global inflation up, too.
Seems likely, based on the analysis. Estimates mentioned suggest maybe a 0.3% bump to core PCE inflation globally by late 2027, or even higher spikes in the short term depending on the tariff levels and retaliation.
And the U.S. deficit situation has global ripples, too, right?
Absolutely. Higher U.S. debt can influence global interest rates, investor confidence in U.S. bonds. The book notes this could affect borrowing costs for other countries and impact overall financial stability.
Any concerns about the broader international economic order?
The analysis touches on potential erosion of trust in the dollar, in U.S. Treasury bonds, as safe assets. Even speculation, though, it's just that, about the dollar's long-term reserve currency status if things become very unstable.
And sector impacts globally, similar to the U.S.
Yeah, interconnectedness means shifts everywhere. The book mentions potential stock market dips globally if major tariffs hit. Agriculture and manufacturing worldwide would be significantly impacted by trade disruptions and changing supply chains.
Okay, so after painting that picture, the book tries to identify potential high-growth sectors under these policies, finding opportunities.
Right, based on the policy priorities. Energy, especially fossil fuels, LNG, refineries, maybe nuclear, seems like an obvious potential beneficiary of deregulation.
Defense and aerospace, too.
Likely, yeah, with potential for increased military spending or focus on space.
What about infrastructure and construction?
If a big infrastructure push happens, then yes, companies involved in building, engineering materials could see a boost.
And manufacturing, but specifically domestic, right? And related services.
It's exactly. Companies focused on reshoring, domestic production, maybe those helping others navigate new trade rules. The book suggests they could see demand.
Border security and law enforcement.
Given the policy emphasis, the book points to companies in surveillance, security tech, enforcement services as potential growth areas.
Financial services. Maybe regional banks, fintech.
Potentially, yeah. If regulations ease, it might favor smaller banks or newer fintech players, according to the analysis. Wealth management too, perhaps?
Healthcare is tricky, but pharmaceuticals, private insurance.
The book suggests possibilities there, depending on specific policies around drug pricing and insurance models, but notes the uncertainty.
Agriculture, tech, real estate, small business, luxury. The book covers a lot.
It touches on many sectors. Agriculture depends heavily on trade outcomes. Tech might see selective growth 5G, AI, maybe platforms aligned with conservative views. Others like real estate, small business, even luxury goods could see indirect benefits from tax cuts or deregulation, though it's less direct.
Okay, let's look at the stock market predictions in the book. Overall, maybe moderate growth, but sector differences.
Yeah, Goldman Sachs' target mentioned was 6,300 for the S&P 500 within 12 months, so some upside. But longer-term returns might be limited.
And sector picks. Energy, defense, financials potentially doing well.
That's what the analysis leans towards.
Yeah.
Energy like Exxon, Chevron, defense like Lockheed, General Dynamics, financials like JP Morgan, BofA.
Tech is more mixed. Autos.
Tech is complex. Potential negatives for global players like Apple, Nvidia due to supply chains. Potential positives for domestic-focused ones like Oracle, Cisco. Autos like Ford, GM might gain. Tesla's position is interesting, potentially benefiting too. But again, the book warns, expect volatility.
And finally, crypto market predictions. The book sounds quite bullish.
It does. Predicts a much friendlier regulatory environment, maybe a lighter touch. That could fuel growth, institutional adoption, more companies holding crypto, more investment products.
Big price targets mentioned for Bitcoin, $100 to $300.
Those kinds of numbers are floated in the analysis, yeah. And growth in altcoins, DeFi, NFTs, Layer 2 solutions. Basically, the U.S. trying to become the crypto capital.
But still speculative.
Highly speculative. The book emphasizes that. Crypto is volatile, depends on many factors beyond just U.S. regulation. So potentially positive outlook in the book's analysis, but with huge caveats.
Wow. Well, that was definitely a deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground from the analysis presented in the book, 4 Years of Economic Change Trump, which, again, you can find on Amazon.
It really shows how interconnected everything is. Taxes, trade, regulation, tech, global factors. It's complex stuff.
Yeah, but hopefully this breakdown of the book's key points gives you a solid framework for understanding the potential landscape ahead. We've tried to pull out the core insights for you.
It's about giving you that shortcut to being informed on these possibilities.
So, here's something to think about. Building on all this analysis from the book, considering these potential shifts, economic, technological, global, or what are maybe the 1 or 2 most significant adjustments, personal or professional, that you might need to consider for the next few years? Definitely food for thought.
Worth reflecting on.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.